This is a review of the article titled A Teleofunctional Account of Evolutionary Mismatch by Noah Porges and Sean Almira. To begin this presentation, we will define and introduce some important ideas that will be relevant throughout the presentation. Evolutionary mismatch is when the environment changes from the environment that an organism adapted to. The mismatch here refers to the mismatch between the ancestral environment, AE for short, and the current environment. A popular debate regarding this theory is whether such a mismatch can always be detrimental to the organism, or if there are certain mismatches that are good, or neither. The paper we chose gives a variation on this definition as an environmental change that leaves certain biological traits unable or less able to perform their intended function. To get the best idea of this concept, the journal article we are reviewing separates this idea into 4 types of mismatch that will be discussed later. Wilson, Lloyd, and colleagues define evolutionary mismatch in a way that limits the effects to negative, and he argues that if the possible benefits need to be included in the discussion, then mismatch cannot be used because it implies something negative. Their definition involves a detrimental deviation from the ancestral environment for the purpose of the term mismatch. The first example given in this paper is sunburns. People who spend a lot of time indoors are more likely to get sunburn when they are exposed to a lot of sun at once. This was obviously not an issue in our ancestral environment because this type of indoor lifestyle was not present in our ancestral environment. Even though wearing clothes or being indoors can increase the risk of sunburns, this did not happen in the ancestral environment, and overall those 2 things are useful in the current environment.
Many researchers argue that the idea of evolutionary mismatch or novelty is the main reason for our developing cognitive abilities. Our brain is constantly developing in order to match the constantly changing environment. This idea is met with 2 main counterarguments. First, adaptations can only exist in response to recurring events in the environment. So saying that our brain is developing to adapt to changing environments is impossible because then it would not be an adaptation because nothing is consistent. The second argument against this idea is that it is extremely difficult to decide whether something is considered evolutionary novel, aka a part of life today that had no evolutionary benefit in the ancestral environment, or evolutionary familiar, aka something that was beneficial back then but no longer beneficial now. Lloyd counters these 2 arguments by explaining that the world itself is constantly changing, and this in itself is some sort of reoccurring event in the environment. Thus, cognitive power can be an adaptation to this as long as our environment continues to change, which it likely will, according to Lloyd. To further understand this idea, we need to understand Neander's concept of proper functions. The proper function of a trait is when the trait produces the intended effect in the environment. Evolutionary familiarity is the environment that is needed for a trait to produce its proper function. These 2 ideas are essentially the exact opposite of mismatch. Millikan describes another form of this idea. Because overall this idea is quite complicated, we will attempt to describe it in simple terms. Millikan describes relational proper function as something that is intended to produce a result in relation to something else. The example that is used in this article is the chameleon, which changes color in relation to the environment that it is in. The proper function of an adapted trait is referred to as the derived proper function, according to Millikan. If there is a discrepancy between the relational proper function of something and the derived proper function of that mechanism, it does not matter, because the derived or adapted is still being fulfilled. It is when the environmental change prevents the proper function where this idea becomes a problem and it enters the idea of being mismatch. There are 4 main types of mismatch that is discussed in this article. The first type is referred to as undevelopment inducing. The second type is referred to as ineffectiveness inducing. The third type is referred to as misrepresentation inducing, and the final type is referred to as misresponse inducing.
The first type of mismatch is undevelopment inducing. This is the most basic form of mismatch and basically describes a situation where the mechanisms for a proper function of a certain trait does not develop fully or is stopped in its development. For example, arms are for grasping things. If thalidomide is present in the womb, these limbs cannot fully develop, and therefore are not able to completely fulfill their function. The second type of mismatch is called ineffectiveness inducing, which is similar to the first type of mismatch, except there is no issue with development of the trait. There is some sort of change in the environment that makes the trait useless. The example given has to do with peppered moth, who during pre-industrial era were colored in order to camouflage with the lichen-covered trees during this time. Pollution later caused this lichen to die, exposing the true color of the bark. To further prove this idea, Millikan incorporates learning into this idea. The biological mechanisms that allow us to learn achieve their direct proper function only when the learned behavior or idea is useful during the current environment. An example for learning is the house cat, who is taught to shake his owner's hand to get food. In the ancestral environment, there was no owner to shake hands with to get food. The cat had to learn to hunt for food. This is a mismatch in a cat's ability to learn to obtain food because it is achieved in a new manner versus how it was in the ancestral environment.
The third type of mismatch is called misrepresentation inducing and is by far the most complicated form of mismatch. To explain it without the complicated terms given in the article, this type of mismatch refers to incorrectly incorporating an adapted trait into a situation where it does not apply or where it will not reach the direct proper function. Objects with specific roles in relation to the organism elicit certain responses within that organism. The response of an organism, due to either evolution or learning, will be different whether the object is a predator or the organism's mother, for example. This is their schema for that certain object or the role of that object in their life, and this schema will guide the organism in future behaviors. Many organisms form schemas about certain things within their life. Specifically, birds and mammals use their siblings and parents to make schemas about potential mates, even though they clearly are not potential mates. So if a duck, who is known to imprint, is raised by humans, which would be an evolutionary novel situation, it will likely try to mate with other species because it mismatched the schema. For example, there's a specific type of bacteria that thrives in water with low oxygen levels, and thus has developed innate magnets that draw it away from highly oxygenated water in a downwards direction. Bacteria that live in the opposite hemisphere have a magnetic pull that draw it towards low oxygen water even if it may be in the another direction. If they were switched, for example, then this would present a novel situation, and thus the adapted mechanism of a magnet would not work in its intended manner. Lastly, social exchange provides more evidence for this idea. In the ancestral environment, there was no guarantee you would not see another individual again unless you killed them, so you acted kindly towards them, assuming you would see them again and they would do the same for you. In the evolutionary novel situation of modern technology, true anonymity exists, so there is no legit reason to constantly help others, even though we as humans tend to do that. That is because there is a mismatch of this mechanism, and we are still acting as though we are in the ancestral environment.
The final type of mismatch is called misresponse inducing, which occurs, and quote, when conditions change such that responses are elicited with different frequencies or chains of behavior are not assembled correctly, where responses no longer achieve the biological purpose for which they evolved, the environment is evolutionary novel, end quote. To go back to the example of the house cat, hunting behavior requires a bunch of different behaviors and motor skills, all of which can be done independently of each other. In the novel situation of the apartment cats, some of these behaviors are not needed, aka, why will a cat pounce at something that poses no threat and stalks shadows? In terms of frequencies, an example is simply many people's living situations. We do not hold the same amount of fear of predators and danger that we did in our ancestral environment because we live in homes and are generally safe from these kinds of things.
To finish up our presentation, we want to present some possible questions and some further research areas that we can explore in order to get a better understanding. The first question is, overall, do you think mismatch is more beneficial or detrimental to our development as human beings? Another possible question is, do you think the fact that our world is constantly changing is a good or bad thing? Another question is, can you think of some other examples of mismatch other than the ones that were given in this article and in the presentation? And the last question is, how do you think studying and better understanding this concept of mismatch can help us as human beings?